Good afternoon, everybody. We have two excellent experts on nuclear security, and they will have a little debate about the question whether how serious we have to take this threat. We have heard often the quote by President Obama in his famous Prague speech, where he talked about the most immediate and extreme threat to global security. And he's mostly quoted as, sure, yeah, it's serious, so we have to talk about it seriously. We have two people here on stage who probably don't have the same opinion when it comes to the seriousness of the threat. There is a threat, nobody would dispute that, but about the seriousness of the threat, there can be a dispute. We have two guests, as I mentioned, Marianne van Leeuwen. She's a professor at the University of Amsterdam, has been with the International Institute Klingendaal here in the Netherlands for a very long time. And Marianne and I go back a long, long time because we had a lot of joint TV experiences and appearances, I should say. Me as an anchor, she is an expert on Iraq, about terrorism, anything when it comes to the international field. And our second expert, William Tobey, he's with the Harvard Center for Science and International Affairs, has been involved in security issues for a very long time as well. This is what we're going to do in the next 45 minutes. I will ask first Marianne and then William to talk about their view and their opinion about this nuclear threat. And then I open the floor for discussion. So, I mean, if you have questions, just, remember them and you will get ample time to ask the questions and get appropriate answers. So, without much further ado, Marianne, please, take it away. Your view on the seriousness of the threat and the quote by Mr. Obama again, the most immediate and extreme threat to global security. Was he right? Was he wrong, Mr. Obama?
I would say that he was right and is right when he says if terrorists manage to get hold of a nuclear explosive, the consequences can be extreme. That is true. It's not necessarily that they will explode such a device. They may also just blackmail people with it. But that would be an extreme threat. I would agree there. With the immediacy, I have more problems. And therefore, I was, in many ways, of course, proud of our Prime Minister that he said, if terrorists manage to get hold of nuclear explosives, the consequences can be extreme. But the likelihood that this will happen is not really immediate. You can't exclude the possibility. But so I would agree half with what President Obama said. But I would like to de-emphasize the immediacy. And I would have as an extra argument for this, we are facing some very vicious opponents in terrorism. Their stock of trade is fear. That's what they want. They want us to be afraid. If we indicate too clearly what we're afraid of, they know our Achilles heel. And maybe you make them larger than life, and that is, don't give them the honor. That's what I would
So you're basically saying by being so active when it comes to the field of nuclear security, we make ourselves more vulnerable instead of make ourselves more secure against these threats?
No, I think that securing nuclear material and radioactive waste and what have you is extremely important and certainly deserves international attention. But my problem is with the terrorism argument. Don't emphasize counterterrorism as your main reason. There are other reasons that are serious as well.
Unless something happens tomorrow, and then we have another dispute here.
Then I'll be terribly wrong. Well, hopefully we'll have a dispute here.
And William will say, well, I told you so.
Well,
maybe.
Maybe I'm talking.
I would take no satisfaction from that.
No, of course, no. It's no laughing matter at all, of course. But I mean, for argument's sake.
Do you want my reaction still briefly on that? I think in counterterrorism, what you see is that intelligence services and people daily involved with security issues, especially when it comes to counterterrorism, they're expected to be flawless. They are not allowed to fail. I remember a press conference with our Ministry of Health a year ago, in which she said, for this year, my aim is 300 deaths in hospitals. Now, she didn't hope for 300 people to die, but the year before it was 500. So she would want that number decreased. That sort of margin you don't get in counterterrorism. Every victim is one too many. I think. And that's
Because
not,
unnecessary.
well, if it's unnecessary,
Avoidable.
of course, it is. That's the issue. Can you guarantee 100% security? I don't think you can, and I don't know whether it would be such a good thing to try and achieve it at all costs, because the costs are high sometimes.
No.
So, do you disagree? Well,
I agree with much of what you've said.
But the immediacy, that's maybe where you
Well-
split, or?
Without necessarily detailing the exact differences, let me explain why I think it's an important and urgent threat. There are three things that are different today than anything that I think has been faced exactly before. First, the terrorists that we face, as you say, are ruthless. We face essentially unlimited terrorist objectives. In the 1980s, the US intelligence establishment produced an analysis of terrorist groups, mainly in Europe, and concluded that if they could get a hold of enough fissile material or a weapon, they would have the capability to detonate a weapon. But they also said that it was unlikely that they would do so because it would defeat their political objectives. Today, with Al-Qaeda and some other groups, we seem to be facing essentially an unlimited bloodlust. They want to inflict as much damage as possible. So the first difference is we're facing an unlimited terrorist objective. Second, nuclear technology has spread far and wide. There are 9 countries with nuclear weapons. There are perhaps tens of thousands of people with nuclear weapons design information. Computer-assisted engineering and design and manufacturing makes precision machining possible, and it can be done in no longer just a few countries, the United States, the Soviet Union, but now in many countries around the world. There's more computing power in my iPhone than there was on the Los Alamos Mesa in 1945. So the ability to take fissile material and turn it into a weapon, unfortunately, has spread. So that leaves the last point. Can terrorists get access to fissile material? And that's what's protecting us, their inability to do so. And there, I think the record is somewhat mixed and shows the importance of this summit. Over the last 20 years, we've had 20 cases in which fissile material has been found outside of the control of proper authorities. Intelligence officers or law enforcement officers have seized it. And while in all of those cases the amount was too small to make a weapon, the incident showed 2 things. First, that there were holes in the fence. Somehow the material got to where it shouldn't have been. And second, in many of the cases, it was claimed that the small amounts were samples of a larger quantity that was for sale, which perhaps could have been used to make a weapon. So when movie detectives look back at a crime and try and figure out who did it, they look for means, motive, and opportunity. We're trying to prevent the crime. And I guess what I'm saying is that means, motive, and opportunity may all be there, and we need to change that.
And you're talking about, quite a few incidents where material was in hands it shouldn't have been in. Secondly, it was seized by law enforcement.
Correct.
But that's a narrow margin of error.
Right. We don't want to, if there have been 20 cases where highly enriched uranium or plutonium has been seized outside of the facilities where it should be, it's great that the law enforcement acted, but it clearly shows a security breakdown.
Because we're talking about globally about huge amounts of nuclear material that is potentially usable in a weapon.
Correct. There are 25 countries with highly enriched uranium or plutonium now, and they store or use that material in hundreds of sites, thousands of tons of material. And if 25 kilograms of it comes loose, it could cause the problem we're talking about.
I'm not a nuclear physicist, and I don't want to argue, or a weapons builder, so I don't really feel in a position to question the difficulty or the ease with which it is possible when you have, assuming that you have enough really explosive material, trustworthy explosive material, so that's highly enriched uranium or plutonium-239, if I'm correct, whether it's easy for amateurs to build a bomb with it. You're of course right that nuclear technology has spread, nuclear knowledge has spread. On the other hand, when you look at rogue states who are trying to build a nuclear weapon, it takes them years. And they have the facility.
Look at Iran.
Look at Iran, look at North Korea. Libya has been at it. Saddam Hussein has been at it. It was very difficult for them as state actors. How could it be easier or not much more difficult for terrorist perpetrators? I would have a question there. I don't have the answer.
But
I would question.
what about you're talking about highly enriched uranium, plutonium? But what about a dirty bomb? You don't need as much,
No.
and you don't need a big explosion. You just contaminate a big area like The Hague or something, and the consequences are unthinkable already without the explosive device.
I would say that the terrorist use of a dirty bomb, I wonder what Will thinks about this, is far less unlikely than terrorists getting hold of a nuclear explosive. But I think the characteristics of an attack with a dirty bomb are really fundamentally different, in that a nuclear explosive, the power of a nuclear explosive is so much larger
The chain reaction
than it would be,
about
than it would be from a conventional explosive that is laced with radioactive material. You can cause, if you play your cards well as a terrorist, let's hope they won't, you can cause enormous disruption by it. And of course through the conventional explosion, and also maybe through the radioactive contamination, you would kill people. But it would still, I think, be a different matter.
More limited.
Yes. So if you look at the balance, extreme effect but and low likelihood, if we are like this for a nuclear explosive, a real nuclear weapon, it goes like this for a dirty bomb.
Not like this.
No, I would say the likelihood is less. It's less unlikely, but the effects arguably would be
Much less too.
less as well. They would be very serious,
Of course.
but they would be less.
Well,
Do you agree?
and then I go to the audience after you.
I agree with much that you say on the likelihood and consequences of a dirty bomb. With respect to the question about why would terrorists find it possible to make a nuclear device, but Iran or North Korea have more difficulty or take time, I think the answer lies in the fissile material, the access to fissile material. So 90% of the effort in the Manhattan Project, the first nuclear weapons effort, the United States effort, went into making the fissile material, not into weapons design or manufacturing. So the key, and the great barrier that the terrorists face is getting a hold of this fissile material. So too with North Korea or perhaps Iran. The question, they've chosen to make the material. What terrorists might do, I think everybody agrees that terrorists are incapable of making this material. They would need a secure site, that was within their control, that was defensible. All of those things are just beyond the capability of a terrorist.
You have the NSA to keep track of that, right?
What they might be able to do, though, is steal the material.
Yeah.
And if they did steal the material, then very likely they could fabricate it into a weapon. Harold Agnew, the third director of Los Alamos, said of this problem, those who say that making a nuclear weapon a crude nuclear device would be easy are wrong, but those who say that it would be very difficult are very wrong.
But imagine, as Marianne pointed out, a dirty bomb, and the consequences are much less. But imagine, just for argument's sake, you have a dirty bomb and it kills 50 people and 1,000 people get sick, which is nothing near to a real explosive device, right? But the psychological consequences, suppose it happens here in Holland or anywhere, will be incredible. The disruption because of people getting scared to death. It could happen in my backyard tomorrow, will be unbelievable.
I think that's right, and actually an even greater consequence would be long-term contamination which couldn't be resolved without spending a lot of money. It is possible to clean up after a dirty bomb, but it costs a lot of money.
Okay. Anybody? Yes, please.
We are talking about nuclear terrorism here, but where does nuclear technology or proliferation of nuclear technology figure into this? Or, I mean, that can also lead to terrorism, stealing information which helps someone to devise something. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I touched a little bit on that. The spread of information that's relevant to making nuclear weapons, I think, does contribute to the seriousness of the threat. So as I mentioned, we now are in a situation in which tens of thousands of people have seen nuclear weapons design information. And significant computing power is ubiquitous. And so I think that there is a significant danger with the spread of technology. I would limit that with respect to, for example, the spread of nuclear energy technology. I don't think the spread of nuclear power reactors necessarily means that the nuclear terrorist threat is elevated, except for the fact that nuclear power reactors could become targets themselves of nuclear terrorists.
In most of the nuclear reactors that are used to generate electricity, the core isn't made up of highly enriched uranium, but of lower levels of enrichment, which are, as such, useless for creating a nuclear bomb. Managing to sabotage a working reactor where the cooling system breaks down and you would get a meltdown, that could be very serious. But I would say, on the other hand, that in most modern electricity installations, it would be difficult to achieve that, to get at it.
I've read that there are also some programs where nuclear energy is kind of taken out from existing nuclear weapons. There are some programs. I think U.S. is doing that already. They are using nuclear weapons and converting it into nuclear energy. So it's already, of course, unless it's state controlled, then it's a different story. But if, let's say, a company which is into creating nuclear energy, it becomes a different story altogether. Yeah, you cannot hand over a nuclear bomb to a company which is into nuclear, generating nuclear energy.
When I was in the U.S. government, one of the programs that I oversaw was the one you refer to, in which the United States bought 500 metric tons of Russian highly enriched uranium, and then that uranium was downblended to the levels that is useful in a nuclear reactor. And as a matter of fact, in the United States, about 20% of electricity is generated through nuclear power. Half of that was fueled through this program. So on average, 1 in 10 light bulbs in America was powered by weapons that had once been aimed at the United States or its allies.
So you burn them up, really?
We burned them up.
Thank you, Mr. Putin. Well,
Exactly.
his predecessors, right?
They got paid for the material.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, please.
And by the way, the relevance to the Nuclear Security Summit is that that material now can never be used by terrorists.
Yeah.
So it's been disposed of, all to the good.
Which
So-
is progress, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
So is the number of nuclear reactors in electricity generation using highly enriched uranium, is that not going down?
Oh, yes, it is. So, of course, these were just power reactors that use low-enriched uranium, but as you point out, there are research reactors that use highly enriched uranium, and that number has diminished, although I would argue that it hasn't fallen far
enough. They should be.
and they
Correct.
barely build any new nuclear power plants in the U.S., right?
I think we have 1 or 2 under construction,
that's
but
about
again,
it.
those are low-enriched uranium.
Yeah, and that's about it. I mean, there are no new plants on the table.
Well, that's United States, or maybe more generally the West, and actually in Germany, they're trying to close down their nuclear reactors, but that's a different story in Far East, isn't it? Where
It is indeed.
nuclear power is on the rise, really.
Yeah.
In Russia, China, India, nuclear power is growing in other states as well, likely Korea, UAE.
Okay, please.
I'm Ishiguro of Yomiuri Shimbun, Japanese newspaper. I would like to, Mr. Tobey, to make sure the numbers that you gave us. You said that the 25 countries actually hold the weapon-grade fissile materials, highly enriched uranium or plutonium, and it is spread around 100 facilities in total, and the amount of this fissile material is 1,000 tons. Is it correct?
I actually said hundreds, plural, of facilities, not simply 100. And I think the amount is approximately 2,000 tons, the total amount.
And could you give me some breakdown of these 2,000 tons among those 5 nuclear weapon countries and other non-nuclear weapon countries?
The overwhelming majority of that material is in the United States and Russia. And the other nuclear weapons states also have smaller but still significant amounts. But remember, what we're talking about here is a relatively small quantity of material that might be useful to terrorists. So if even 25 kilograms of material, 25 or 50 kilograms of material fell into the hands of terrorists, it could cause a detonation.
For just as a figure, among ordinary countries, non-nuclear weapon countries, those countries like North Korea or Pakistan or India or Israel, how many tons are there in the hands of those ordinary countries?
If you want the details for quantities, there's actually a report that some of my colleagues and I have put together that's available on the Belfer Center website, and I'd be happy to go through figures with you on that.
Okay, I'll be happy.
Sure. Yeah.
No, I would return to the issue of dirty bombs and the necessity not just to have secure storage for highly enriched uranium and plutonium, but also for maybe less spectacular at first sight materials that are in use not in reactors or not in electricity installations, not in research reactors, but in hospitals or in agricultural laboratories. This is all material. Some of it is more usable than other material that should be stored safely. And I could imagine that the problem is for people, when you work with these quantities, small quantities, if you work with them daily, it becomes routine, so that if this, the conference now is focusing on these matters as well, to see to it that that material as well is securely stored, and that people who work with it realize that they are working with material that can be used for very good purposes, but can also be used for very bad purposes, and also can be very hazardous for your health anyway. That would be another important, I think, purpose for the conference.
Mm-hmm.
Not just highly enriched uranium and plutonium, also cesium and what you have. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree exactly with what you say, that we face a perhaps more likely threat of consequences that aren't as bad. But I also think we need to attend to the high consequence event, even if it has a lower probability.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Yes?
Okay, my name is Dahono. I'm from Kompas Daily in Jakarta, Indonesia. So my first question is to Mr. Tobey. You said that if somebody got hold of the fissile material, it's not that very difficult to build a bomb. So maybe could you explain more about that? Basically, what is needed for somebody to build a bomb once they got the fissile material? Is it can be built, I imagine, inside the cave in Afghanistan, maybe, something like that? Or you need a more elaborate technology? And maybe my second question for Ms. van Leeuwen is, so basically, are you saying that this summit is useless or something like that? Or, thank you. Yeah.
Would you go first? Right?
Certainly. So
you can think about your answer.
Oh, I
right?
know my answer. No, I know my answer.
well, I'm not sure whether it can be done in a cave in Afghanistan, but it doesn't necessarily have to be done in a cave in Afghanistan. And I would point out that in August of 2001, just before the September 11th attacks, it's reported that Osama bin Laden had a conversation around a campfire in the mountains of Afghanistan and asked a nuclear expert, what would it take to make a nuclear weapon? And his answer was the fissile material. If you can get a hold of the fissile material, then you can probably get a weapon. Now, thank goodness Al-Qaeda hasn't done that. And people
Was
may
he right, in your opinion?
Well, I would fall back again on what Harold Agnew said, that it's not an easy thing to do, but to say that it's very hard, very difficult is also wrong. It would take some technical knowledge, but unfortunately that technical knowledge has spread. Yeah. Now people may say, well, Al-Qaeda's, bin Laden is dead, and Al-Qaeda's been sort of diminished. And of course that's all to the good from my perspective, but I'm not sure it's enough, because if you look at the key figures within Al-Qaeda's nuclear effort, all of them remain at large, and one of them, the guy who headed the program, has been raised to Al-Qaeda's leadership. So I hear.
But useless summit, question mark.
Certainly not, no. I wouldn't say this is a useless summit at all. I think the safe storage of nuclear material and promoting security awareness among professionals who work with this material is extremely important, and especially it is an international problem. I mean, the results when things go wrong may easily become international, so it's good to have high-level international attention to it. My problem is with the emphasis on nuclear terrorism. I would say there is not just a quantitative but also qualitative difference between a dirty bomb and a nuclear explosive. And the emphasis on the worst case scenario. The immediate case scenario is bad enough. Don't make it bigger than it is, that would be mine.
But suppose, a question for both of you, suppose, President Obama had come to you guys in 2009, so before he did the Prague speech and everything, and he said, now this is the thing I'm contemplating, and this is vaguely the plan for, a bunch of summits and stuff. What kind of advice would you have given him? He said, Mr. President, it's a great idea, but?
Don't call it nuclear terrorism. Give it some other. I mean, it would not be as sexy, probably. It would be a longer name. But call it.
So the title of your summit would have been?
I would point at radioactive material, at bombs and dirty bombs.
That's pretty long,
It is too long, I agree. But here we go. It's still, that's a problem of a promotion argument rather than the issue that's really at stake.
What would you have said, Bill? Well, you have been in the White House.
You would
for
say
a while,
nuclear
so
terrorism.
You're closer to the source.
Not
maybe.
under this administration,
No,
but I would say that focusing like a laser on the nuclear security issue has been to the president's advantage, that he's achieved more than he otherwise could have by not only focusing on the nuclear issue, but also within the nuclear issue, making sure that other issues like disarmament or whether or not nuclear power in general is a good idea have been let to the side for other forums. So
They should not be overshadowed by this conference, though, I would think.
Those are important issues.
Yeah.
But I do think that if the nuclear security, government's all about making choices. And the president said, as you quoted, that he thought the biggest threat that we face is the nuclear terrorism threat. And so he was going to focus on that first.
And the big benefits of this whole process is awareness. Number of countries that actually possess this material is going down quite rapidly, actually. People talk to each other instead of fighting, which is, imagine, with stuff going on in Ukraine and everything. So those are the main benefits in your view?
I see two primary benefits. First of all, the leaders have agreed that this problem is important and urgent, and they've taken some personal responsibility. There's a proposition in the private sector, that a CEO can't delegate his responsibility to provide safe and secure conditions. In other words, if you run a nuclear power plant for an electric company, you can't say, well, that's somebody else's job if you're the CEO. I think the same is true for national leaders, that nuclear security is their responsibility.
Yeah.
And the second thing that's the summits have done has they've been able to establish tangible progress. 13 states that once had this material no longer do. They've cut through red tape. Some of the people operating lower down in the bureaucracy had goodwill, but they couldn't get done what they needed to get done without help from the top.
What about you, about these benefits?
I don't disagree with that at all. But we're talking, the content of your argument is secure storage of nuclear material and taking responsibility when you work with it. Who would not agree with that? And I'm quite sure that it's good that there's a lot of international attention to it now and that results have been made. Also, if you focus on this issue and you leave aside for the moment politically highly sensitive subjects like disarmament by the nuclear weapon states, you can make easier progress, because this is what we have seen in the official conference cycle of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This is an item that recurs all the time, isn't it? I think it's an important item, but of course, if you just talk about that, you can't focus also on nuclear security. As far as that's concerned, I would agree with Bill Tobey here. But I do also think that the larger picture of proliferation issues is not just about terrorism, but also about rogue states. And it is also about the nuclear arsenals of the nuclear haves, which continue to stir frustration among certain non-nuclear weapon states and say, why should they have it? If it's evidently useful to them, why should we continue to give up on it?
Okay. Yes, please.
I would just like you to touch upon some of the global laws, or if there are any in talks, relating to prevent this, the laws. Or are there countries working together to make a certain law which are applicable at a global level? Let's say some terrorist is indeed caught with some nuclear weapon. Is he subjected to the law of the land or some global laws, for example?
If I understood your question correctly, you were asking about whether there are international treaties or conventions that might allow nations to work together on these problems. And in fact, there are. There's an international convention for the suppression of acts of nuclear terrorism, and there's a convention on the physical protection of nuclear material, both of which essentially require states to use their legal authorities to make sure that nuclear terrorism won't be undertaken.
I'm sorry, I'm not really very familiar with this subject. That's the reason I'm asking you. So a person or someone, a terrorist caught with nuclear material, for example, he would be tried in an international court?
Oh, I see. No, actually what these treaties require is that nations would criminalize those acts. So by signing up to that treaty, the states undertake to use their own national legal systems to prosecute acts of nuclear terrorism. And I should add there's actually one more element in this, and that's United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540, which requires states to enact and enforce effective export controls to secure their own nuclear materials and other materials, and also to make proliferation by non-state actors illegal.
We've been looking, at the process since, let's say, 2010, when Mr. Obama started this whole thing. Now let's try to look ahead. Where are we 5 or 10 years down the road when it comes to nuclear security? Marianne, you first.
Let's fervently hope we haven't had a case of nuclear terrorism. Again, the likelihood of terrorists using dirty material or chemical material, well, that's a possibility that it happens. There will be one more summit, isn't it, in 2 years' time?
Yeah. Yes.
it would be a very good thing if the impulse that has been given in the previous conferences, and this conference and the next, will create a better awareness of the necessity to secure nuclear material, to lower the number of reactors that work on highly enriched or uranium or plutonium. That should be achievable, don't you think? But that's something that you have to work for. So in that respect, it might be actually better than it is now. We'll still have terrorism around, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I think what we should hope for are two things. First, that the number of sites that have nuclear material has been taken to the lowest possible level.
There's still
And
a
we
lot out there, right?
There are still hundreds of sites, and we don't need so many sites. And then second, with those sites that still remain, that they're defended to a reasonable standard. And that reasonable standard, there should be a minimum level of protection designed by the threat that's faced, and then augmented if the threat is greater. As in certain countries, obviously face a greater terrorism threat than other countries. And it has to be backed up by sufficient budgetary and regulatory authorities to make sure that that effort's sustained. I would also add that I think this is, while the Netherlands has undertaken an enormous effort to put this on, and to its great credit, and I feel for the people of Amsterdam and The Hague, and therefore, understand that there is some summit fatigue, that people may think, well, after 2016, we should stop doing summits. And that may well be the case, but I think what cannot stop is the responsibility of heads of state and heads of government for nuclear security.
Okay.
On that we don't disagree, you see.
Terrific. Finally, we agree on something. Terrific. Thank you very much, Marianne. Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you.
Thanks.